In part one, we had a glimpse into the past, when a North American indigenous woman, Donna Deltour, met Europeans for the first time. Sometimes we use the term contact to refer to these initial encounters. As we'll see in this and the next two parts of the lecture, what takes place between Europeans and North America's indigenous peoples after first contact sets the stage for how much of the continent is going to develop politically and economically in subsequent centuries. To begin, let's clarify what we mean by some of the important terms we'll be using in this lecture. The relationships that developed between Europeans and indigenous peoples are complex, and there are variations and differences depending on where in North America these interactions were taking place. But right across the continent, as Europeans arrived and then settled, colonialism was fundamental and consistent. The Oxford Dictionary gives us a straightforward definition of this word. Political control and economic exploitation are the key ideas associated with the concept. How colonialism operated in the distinct parts of North America did depend on the particular nature of the relationship between Europeans and the indigenous peoples that lived in a given place and time. Sometimes the colonial relationship was very reciprocal. At other times, the word conquest would better describe the state of relations between the two groups. Whenever and wherever colonialism was taking place, however, we should always remember that there were two parties to these encounters, and each brought their own perspectives to the table. It might seem easiest to generalize and characterize all North American indigenous peoples as victims of colonialism, and there's absolutely no denying the horrific and brutal consequences that resulted from these encounters. But we should also remember that indigenous peoples reacted to these encounters in any number of ways, and often demonstrated incredible agency in responding to the pressures that arose with the arrival of Europeans in their lands. Since our course takes place at a Canadian university, let's spend the rest of this part of the lecture examining colonization as it occurred here, in this part of the continent. In fact, let's get even more local, and first acknowledge with sincere gratitude the fact that the very institution in which we are learning sits on the traditional lands associated with a number of Aboriginal peoples, including the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe. Archaeological evidence suggests that the original inhabitants of North America arrived here from Asia, either by oceanic voyages or over the Bering Land Bridge in Beringia. These migrations are thought to have occurred at least 20,000 years ago, perhaps as much as 40,000 years ago. The highest population concentrations in what we now call Canada are thought to have been on the Pacific coast. For example, there's much evidence of Haida settlement in Haida Gwaii that dates back some 12,000 years. By 1000 BCE, we definitively know the northeastern seaboard of modern Canada was also occupied. In the period just prior to contact with Europeans, conservative estimates suggest the population of First Nations was between 500,000 and 2 million. Now, in spite of what I have just said about all the scientific and archaeological evidence, it's really important that we recognize that First Nations firmly believe they have existed here from the beginning of time. They have no oral history that tells them of being anywhere else. It's also critical that we acknowledge the particular significance of land to indigenous peoples. North America, and even Canada within North America, is incredibly diverse in geographic and environmental terms. Aboriginal peoples readily adapted to this environmental diversity and existed in a symbiotic relationship with the land, dependent upon it as they were for food and sustenance. The Inuit in the far north are perhaps the most obvious example, adapting housing, weapons, art, and transportation to their environment. Adaptation is also obvious when we consider the heterogeneity of First Nations. They are tremendously diverse. Consider linguistic differences alone. There are over 60 languages in 52 nations. And here, I'm only speaking of First Nations in Canada. Not counting very early trips by the Vikings in this part of North America, the earliest European explorations were by John Cabot in Newfoundland in 1497, Jacques Cartier in the St. Lawrence in 1534, Martin Frobisher in the Northwest Passage in the 1570s, Henry Hudson in Hudson's Bay in 1610, and Samuel de Champlain along the St. Lawrence and inland in the early 1600s. Now, given what I said earlier about Indigenous peoples having lived here at least for millennia, please do keep in mind that these are voyages of exploration. They're definitely not discoveries. These particular explorers in this part of the continent found no evidence of wealthy civilizations, at least not wealth in the material terms of Western civilization. This was quite different from the experience in the South. I'll address that area of the continent in the next part of the lecture. Here in the North, however, there were resources ripe for economic exploitation. So European contact still leads to colonialism, but it will be a different form of colonialism than was seen in other parts of North America. Initially, at least, a more reciprocal approach would need to be taken to generate wealth. Put another way, outright conquest didn't make much business sense here. Trade in animal furs became the key economic interface between First Nations and European colonizers, and proved to be a major economic force in the development of Canada. The fur trade begins as early as the 16th century, but only as a minor activity relative to fishing. Then, in the 17th century, the fur trade really takes off. What drives this development? Believe it or not, this guy. Why the beaver? Because of these. Yes, that's right, hats. Imagine for a moment just how exceptionally fashionable you could be walking the streets of London in one of these. More to the point, imagine the value of a water-resistant fur-covered hat for those stuck in rainy England. The south of the continent had gold and the north had beavers. In a sense, Canada is the consequence of a European fashion trend that almost drove the beaver to extinction. The story of the fur trade parallels imperial rivalries in North America. The earliest competition was between the Dutch in New York State and the French in the 1600s. Initially, French settlement was encouraged through the Compagnie des Sans Soucis. An example of their work can actually still be seen in Midland, Ontario today, the Jesuit settlement of St. Marie among the Huron. My family visited here a few years ago. Maybe you've been there too. Such settlements proved difficult, though, as most men ran away into the woods, literally. These fur traders come to be known as coureurs de bois. This certainly made sense when only 1 in 7 men was likely to find a wife to marry, leading eventually to farming and settlement for those who did find wives. Competition in the fur trade shifts in 1670, when the English established a post on Hudson's Bay with a royally chartered company. We know it today as the Hudson's Bay Company, or the Bay. It is, in fact, the oldest commercial corporation in North America. Until Britain defeats France in the Battle of Quebec in 1759, bringing French colonialism in North America to an end, the French had dominated the fur trade. They controlled the main waterways through the west. They had a good supply of canoe building material. They understood well which trade goods would work best with First Nations, and they had relatively good relations with those First Nations, including kinship ties through intermarriage. In contrast, the Hudson's Bay Company didn't really push trade inland. Theirs was a more lazy approach, if you will, establish a post and wait for First Nation traders to arrive. In effect, 2 fur trade systems emerged. The French traded along the St. Lawrence, extending down along the Mississippi and into the Prairie West. The British in Rupert's Land, the drainage basin of Hudson's Bay, maintained this sort of more passive approach. After their defeat, the English and Scots took over the French fur trade system, centered in Montreal. The Northwest Company is created, and eventually comes to compete very successfully against the HBC until it is merged with the HBC completely. Why talk about the fur trade? Why is it important? The fur trade results in economic development and European exploration into the heart of this part of the continent, and it provides the backdrop for the interplay between First Nations and European colonizers that is important to the life of Femme Deltour, who we met in the first part of the lecture, and to the interconnections of intermarriage addressed by Sylvia Van Kirk. The fur trade has also been used to explain not only Canada's development, but why Canada's development, or why it developed the way it did, east to west, avoiding connections north to south. Harold Innes, a professor and political economist at the University of Toronto beginning in the 1920s, developed the Staples thesis to describe the significance of this trade to Canadian economic development. In a nutshell, Innes argued that Canada's evolution as a nation was best explained by recognizing how a series of key or fundamental natural resources were economically exploited one after the other. Wealth generated from exploiting a resource was the engine of economic development, and the profits typically traveled from the hinterland, where the resources were located, to metropolitan centers that will become the large Canadian cities. Fur was just one such resource at a particular point in time in the nation's history. With his Staples thesis, Innes is essentially creating what we might call a meta-narrative, a big story that is meant to explain to Canadians why we came to be as a nation. This concept of the meta-narrative is important to our course as we try to understand the idea of nations and how they relate both to North America as a whole and to one another on the continent. As we come to the end of this part of the lecture, I don't want to leave you with the impression that Canada's Indigenous peoples should be dealt with entirely in a historical context. But their original presence on the lands of what will become Canada and their early relations with Europeans are key to understanding much of the contemporary situation for Canada's Aboriginal peoples and for Canada more broadly. Current conflicts over land resources, the desire to be treated with respect, are all much more easily understood if we appreciate the context from which these issues arise. Colonialism in Canada has had consequences, at times very serious consequences. The BNA Act, or Constitution Act of 1867, that created the nation state at Confederation, assigned jurisdiction over Indians and land reserved for Indians to the federal government. In 1876, the first Indian Act was passed, and it clearly had an assimilationist agenda. For example, ask yourself, why did First Nations women who married white men lose their status? This is a clear example of the state or nation deciding who is an Indian. Following on Confederation in 1867, when some of the remaining British colonies in North America come together to form Canada, the new central or federal government acted quickly to acquire lands from the First Nations in a treaty-making process that is too involved to address in today's lecture, but that certainly was carried out in a way that violated the spirit of the original compacts between First Nations and the European colonizers. An entire residential school system was also created to remove Aboriginal children from their parents and communities, and to expedite their assimilation into Euro-Canadian culture. The social and cultural consequences of this system were genocidal in terms of culture, language, and health of communities and First Nations children. This legacy has had and continues to have significant consequences for First Nations in contemporary Canadian society, and we'll explore that theme again later in the course. That's the end of this part of the lecture. In the next part, we're going to examine colonization in what is now Mexico. Bye for now. We'll see you in part 3.